go back to that issue of cemeteries. Now, I know it's not something we want to talk about, but believe me, you know it, we all know it. It will affect us all in the end. And you tend to only focus on it when you're in a time of personal grief and tragedy. Obviously, it's morbid, it is, but our cemeteries are facing a real crisis. There is a shortage of cemetery capacity. They're filling up, and they are filling up fast. Here to talk about this is a research fellow in social and political sciences at Melbourne University, Dr. Hannah Gould. Hannah, you've got a report there titled The 11th Hour, which essentially is a statutory review of New South Wales Cemeteries and Crematoria Act, and it highlights a really important issue. Talk us through it.
Thank you, Vita, and thank you for having me on. And as you said, it's a really important issue, even if it's a somewhat uncomfortable one. So the report is actually quite drastic, and it says that if we don't act now, or at least within the next 3 years, then Sydney's cemeteries are going to run out of space. And what that means is that you can go out today and purchase a grave, but if, say, in 10 or 12 years, you want to purchase a grave and someone's died that you love, you will be unable to do so simply because we haven't given enough priority to finding new spaces for cemeteries.
So is it just the case that governments have been sitting on their hands, have not allocated new grounds for cemeteries? Is that the problem?
Partially. I mean, the report is very critical of the CCNSW, which is the regulatory authority overseeing cemeteries, and suggesting that it hasn't gone out and actively attempted to find space. You know, when we build a new city, we build a new suburb, we think about things like hospitals, schools, public transport. What we don't think about is that other bit of vital public infrastructure, which is the cemetery. It's also the suggestion that really the cemetery sector hasn't been regulated to the extent that it needs to be. So sometimes there's bad actors, there's a lack of transparency. So what that really creates is inequalities in our cemetery sector. And so the report wants us both to find new space, new landscapes for the dead in Sydney, but also to think about how we control cemetery sector.
I wouldn't even know, now that we're talking about this, I wouldn't even know who might be the minister for cemeteries at a state government level. I presume it's a state government level. Hannah, do we know?
Well, that's actually the real big issue, which is that death care as an issue is kind of cut up, and it's different authorities that regulate certain different parts of it. So it's a state by state or state and territory issue, not a federal issue. And then in each state, how death care, how cemeteries, how funerals, how palliative care, end-of-life care are regulated is really different. And often that's the main issue, is that there's no one to lobby, there's no one to raise these issues with, because there isn't very clear chain of command about who's actually responsible for doing this. And so it just falls further and further down the list of priorities.
And look, I would expect, you know, there would be quite significant cultural differences amongst ethnicities or religious groups, those that will allow and want burials. Some would want cremations. You know, like, this is all part of the debate too, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. So in Sydney, we have about 67% of the population opting for cremation, and that's relatively the same all across Australia. So about 67, 70% of Australians choose to cremate. But there is a core group of people for whom cremation is never going to be the viable option. Okay, and these people, you know, Orthodox Christians, the Jewish community, various other religious and ethnic groups. For them, you know, burial is very, very important. And actually, these are the people who have the most to lose, I suppose, with this future of cemeteries being in crisis. You know, there are some actual cultural and ethnic groups who live in Sydney at the moment who have been told they only have 3 years worth of burial spots in cemeteries at the moment. And then after those 3 years, they're going to run out of space for where to put their dead.
Well, just on that, when you buy a plot and a body is in that plot of someone you love, have you got that plot, that piece of ground forever, or is it a time-limited period?
This is actually one of the major issues that is driving this problem all throughout Australia. We have a system of what is called in perpetuity, which means that in most cases, in Victoria, in most of New South Wales, for example, once you buy an interment right, once you put somebody into the ground, you own that land indefinitely, and that land can never be used for something else. It's actually really unusual around the world. In most of Europe, 25, 30 years, and then you move to a kind of more memorialisation. You remove the gravestone. One of the recommendations that the report actually suggests is that we move to something that's called a renewable grave system. So that's not, mandatory that you don't own that grave. It's that the grave is at least 25 years, and that every 5 years after that, they come to the family and ask the family, would you still like to have a grave here? Would you still like to continue to tend for and care for this grave? And if the answer is no, then that headstone is respectfully removed and that grave is able to be used by somebody else. Because
let me just jump in there, Hannah. Though I can hear governments getting the calculator out. Of course, when they come to you at that 5-year junction, and the next 5 years, there'll be a payment there, won't there?
There is currently a payment anyway. I mean, we pay cemeteries for the continual maintenance of graves, for keeping the lawns beautiful, for horticulture, for making sure that some of these really old monumental graves, they have these huge angels and beautiful things, but they have a tendency to degrade or fall down. So we are currently, paying for the maintenance of our graves. The issue is that cemeteries, because they're in perpetuity, have a lot of graves that they're not getting any kind of fees from anymore, and they have to continually look after them indefinitely, forever. So moving to a renewable grave system is a really important part of the solution going forward.
All right, people at home, go to my Facebook page under Dr. Hannah Gould. I'd love to know what you think, and we'll get Hannah back on and we'll go through some of your feedback. Hannah, that's fantastic. It's fascinating stuff. It's important. We've got to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you.